Please support this channel by clicking on the links below. The Golden Age of the Moor, edited by Ivan van Sertima. The African Heritage and Ethno-history of the Moors. Background to the emergence of early Berber and Arab peoples from prehistory to the Islamic dynasties, by Dana Reynolds. Part 2. The Libyans and Moors as seen by the Greeks and Romans. The early ethno-history of the North Africans and the emergence of the Islamic Moorish dynasties has been fairly well documented by the works of Arab historians and earlier manuscripts. The tribes who comprised the Moors were apparently in many cases identified by the same clan names as they were known in the area of Carthage and Numidia in the centuries before the Christian era. Although some modern Berbers are neither fully African nor European in appearance, several tribes have changed very little, and the adjective Ethiopian can just as well suit them today as it did in ancient times. The word Libau or Libyan was one of the first terms for the black or dark-skinned indigenes in North Africa before the time of the European colonizations. Ulrich Bates, a scholar familiar with the archaeology and ethno-history of ancient northern Africa, noted in his book, The Eastern Libyans, that all of the oldest representations of the Libyans in Eastern iconography shows dark brown-skinned men. Only in later times, after the 12th dynasty, do the paintings show other types under the same terms. Among the most common names for the Libyans in ancient Egypt are Tihinau, Temahu, and Libu. Another scholar more recently places the first appearance of blonde Libyans under the name of Temahu during the time of Seti of the 19th dynasty. The name Temahu previously referred to a land located to the west of the Nile in what is now called Libya and Sudan. It seems the migrations of the peoples of the sea coming from areas to the north of the Mediterranean Sea and the isles of the sea had led to the settlement of people related to Scythians or the later Hellenic Greeks in the areas of the African Libyans. The Egyptians came to utilize the terms Libu, Libyan, Tamahu, and other originally ethnic terms in the sense of Westerner, and thus many types of peoples of differing origin who came to inhabit the area of modern Libya were represented under terms formerly denoting the Ethiopic or Hamitic indigenes. For the Greeks and Romans, Libya became the ancient name of the whole of North Africa. They were well aware of the presence of foreigners or colonists in North Africa from Asia Minor who were descended from Scythians and Phoenicians. However, they recognized an indigenous and relatively homogeneous group of Libyans whom they spoke of in their allegories as the descendants of Danaus and the Danaides and a Nile-born Epaphus, described as black in ancient writings. It was this sort of North African who was most often referred to as Libyan by the Greeks and Romans, and it is they who were the ancestors of the Morisoi, or Moors, among whom were the Berbers. Being Africans and closely affiliated with pastoral groups further east, they were a people whose customs and religion were almost entirely African at the time of the first encounter with Roman colonists. They scarred and painted their faces like other Africans. They wore their hair in totemic styles and braids. They did not eat of the flesh of cows, as is the custom of many of the more traditional Cushitic peoples today. Some of the Libyan tribes that are mentioned by Herodotus are the Nasamones, Gendanes, Makles, Gamphansantes, Gilgame, Sali, Atlanteans, Lotophagi, Masai, Andromedai, and Ausians. The Andromedae were directly west of the Egyptian delta in Herodotus's day, although they are described a few centuries later as a people along the Nile in northern Nubia. The Nasamones were in Syrtis Major, across the southern slope of Cyrenaica in modern Libya. The Nasamones controlled the Argila Oasis in Libya. The Masai were directly west of the Nasamones. Machlis were in the Lesser Syrtis on the Libyan coast. The Lotophagi were in the west of Libya, and the Gamfansantes were considered a section of the Garamantes, who were more or less agriculturalist and pastoralist in the Fezzan area. The Ammonians were a sedentary people in the Siwa oasis in Libya and partly Egyptian. Later, ancient writers mention many other tribes. They include people like the Maramoridae, Zigrite, Moris, Lagwathes, or Levathes, who were a tribe of the Morosai, or Moors, Mazikes, another Morosoid people, the Farusai of southern Morocco, the Iribidae, the Tedamansi, Abistae, Hesperidae, Nigritae, Gaetuli, and a host of other peoples. According to Strabo of the 1st century, the Marmaridae lay along the shore next to Egypt, extending west to Cyrenaica and south to Ammonium. The Hesperidae lived in the fertile part of Cyrenaica. According to Philistus, the Aribidae and the Gendanes were part of the Lodophagi. The Levathis Mores were in Leptis Magna at the time of Emperor Justinian of the 4th century. Sallust, a few centuries earlier, calls the Moris a people in the area closest to Spain. A people called Gaetules were said by Eustathius to be the greatest or largest of the Libyan tribes. According also to Strabo, they were the most numerous. They extended along the South Atlas slopes eastward toward the Syrtis Major. They composed a number of sub-tribes, including Negizi, Banore, Bagatules, Dere, and others. It is possible that they were also the Atlantinians of early writers. Pliny and Tacitus mention tribes like the Mussolini or Massili, and the Massili who were possibly the Macae Libyans mentioned by Herodotus. Ptolemy mentions the Seli, a tribe next to the Nasamones. Bates thought that the root "sel" was an ethnic term preserved in names like Seli, Massili, and Massilis. Zel, Gel, or Kel is a modern Berber root meaning clan. Procopius implies that these Massilis or Massili who lived in the ancient kingdom of Numidia were Moors and Gaetules trained by a leader named Massinina to be soldiers. The Luwata were a prominent tribe mentioned in Arab writings. They were the Levathes or Ilagwathes and Leucada spoken of by Procopius and Corippus and others. Corippus of the 6th century A.D., who speaks of the Lagwathes, saying that among them were a pitiless tribe called Osiriani, otherwise called Astores or Astacures. They also lived in Ethiopia. The Luwata had several sub-tribes, including Mazikis. Procopius says that they were a tribe of the Morosoi who occupied the area of Tripoli and Tunis, while other Mores lived in Byzantium and Numidia. The Moors were said by Procopius to have colonized parts of the Iberian Peninsula over 1,000 years before. The Libyan races shared various customs, some of which were admirable, while others inspired less appreciation. They were, like the men and women of Arabia, accustomed to raiding and pillaging, especially from the desert fringes. The historian Diodorus in the 1st century BC spoke of the Gaetules as a people who made robbery their constant practice, attacking unexpectedly from the desert. Nonus calls the Moors a people of the desert, stung with mad lust of robber welfare. Tacitus describes the Garamantes as an ungovernable tribe, always engaged in practicing brigandage on their neighbors. Another custom shared by the Libyans was the penchant for dwelling in caverns and grottos. Pausanias said that the Libyans lived in huts and in natural caverns and in man-made grottos. Such people were found among the Gaetules and the Pharisai. Strabo said that certain of the Pharisai, then in southern Morocco, lived in grottos that they built. Such people in Arabia and Ethiopia east of the Nile were named Troglodytes. Herodotus mentions that the Ethiopian Troglodytes also lived in the Fezzan area of Libya. The Mori Mazazeses, or Mazikes, in the area of Tripoli and Tunis were called Ethiopians in an ancient Roman document entitled the Exposition Totius Mundi. It is these Moors who composed the African or Ethiopian luxury slaves in Rome, where they were called Amazegzeg and Amazik. The lifestyle of the Libyans and their appearance apparently differed little from those nomadic peoples east of the Nile. Strabo, who lived between 63 or 64 BC and 23 AD, spoke of the Maurusians as a people who braided their hair, grew beards, wore hair ornaments, pared their nails, fought mostly with javelins, rode bareback, and wore skins of leopards and lions. He said that they dressed like their neighbors, the Masaeli of Numidia, and like most of the Libyan tribes in general. Later, the Moors are described by Procopius as a people who lived in huts and wear a thick cloak and a rough shirt at all times. They also had camels, shields, javelins, and swords. The men wore earrings in one ear. They dwelt in Byzantium, Tripolitania, and Numidia, and their women uttered oracles in trance-like states and foretold the future. Morai Gensani, or Quinque Gentanii, are mentioned as nomadic tribes between Barca in Libya and the Shats region of Algeria. The later name for the Moors of Barca are Luata, Levathes, or Ilguathes. Corippus mentions them in the 6th century as carrying a long sword with a short sword attached to the arm. It is the custom of modern Beja and other Cushitic and Nilo-Saharan speaking tribes of the eastern Sudan to carry these arm or wrist daggers and at times long swords. The Moors are also known to have been ruled by female chiefs, holy women or queens even in the time of Islamization of North Africa. Procopius mentions that they often rode in chariots into battle with men, helping them with their arms of iron. The original Amazons were said to have been Libyan women, and the war goddess Athena was supposedly from Libya. Diodorus Siculus wrote about the Amazons in the era of Hespera. Quote, "It was the custom for women to practice the arts of war and to serve in the army for a fixed time. And if it had happened that a girl was born, its breasts were seared that they might not develop at the time of maturity. For they thought that the breast, as they stood out from the body, were no small hindrance in warfare." End quote. Two different European missionaries in 16th century Ethiopia described this same custom among certain tribes there. Of the young girls, it was said the elders seared off one of the breasts with a hot iron while they were young, in order not to impede drawing the arrow. They rode on camels and were great archers. Saharan rock drawings seem to display women with a single breast. Herodotus had spoken of a custom of the women of the Libyans called Alcians, who had a kind of ritual fight with stones and clubs in honor of Athena or Minerva. The girdle of Athena, according to him, was taken from the goat skin of Aegeus, worn by the Libyan women. This is worn by Ethiopian women to this day. Between the sea and the Gaetulis, extending from the Atlas Mountains to the Syrtis Major in Libya, were men with many wives and children, who in many respects were like the nomadic Arabians. They are described as plaiting their hair, polishing their teeth, filing their nails, wearing gold ornaments, and they rarely touched one another as they walked, so that they wouldn't disturb the arrangement of their hair, which held totemic sanctity. They followed horse breeding with exceptional interest. A very similar description is given of the Nasamones in Libya by Gabinius within the same century. They wear gold ornaments, they polish their teeth, and file their nails. We very seldom see them touch one another as they stroll around, for they do not like their hairdressing disturbed. Their horse-born warriors have spears and swords. They wear unbelted robes, and some use war chariots. They have many wives and children, and resemble the wandering shepherds of Arabia. But instead of plaiting their hair, they curled it. Curling their hair with hot irons was a practice of the Nubians as well. The Nasamones foretold the future by going to lay on the graves of their ancestors. The semi-nude and completely nude state was a mark of the Libyans at the time of Christ. Nasamonians were seen nude as often as they were seen in robes. Garamantes and Pharusi were described as a people wandering about half nude and nude, which is how the Libyans were often portrayed in early Egyptian iconography and Saharan rock art. The Garamantes, Nasamonians, Pharusi, and Morosai were accustomed to using small war chariots as well as four-horsed chariots. Thus, the early demographers in the first few centuries AD commented on several facets of the lifestyle common to tribes located in North Africa under various names. These traits included their preoccupation with desert raids, horse rearing, hygiene, and hairdressing, their access to gold and its usage in accessorizing their dress, their polygamous social relations with the Greeks interpreted as a form of promiscuity, and the social status and liberty of Libyan women and their resemblance to the wandering tribes of Arabia. The last, but certainly not the least important, of the distinguishing features which the early Greeks and Romans ascribed to the Libyans is a black complexion, which was sometimes said to be accompanied by a reddish cast. All of the most important Libyan tribes are described as black-skinned. Martial, Carippus, Procopius, Juvenal, and Silius Italicus referred to the Moors as black-skinned. Polemon, in his physiognomical scriptures, and Admantius confused the Libyans with the Ethiopians because of their light color. They were also at times described as light of build and woolly-haired. The predominant type in ancient East Africa, like those of ancient Nubia, Egypt, and Arabia, were basically a lightly built, gracile, or lanky type, which is typical of many of the pastoralists of Abyssinia and Eritrea, extending to northern Kenya and some of the tribes of modern Arabia. The description of the wandering tribes of North Africa from the earliest periods to early medieval times recalls the phenotypical attributes and customs typical of the people of the speakers of the Cushitic and Nilo-Saharan dialects, as well as pastoral Fulani and other Sahelian pastoralists. This is borne out by the skeletal evidence found in the Sahara and Fezzan eras, dating from the era of the Garamantes and even before. Libyan ethno-history before the 5th century AD. In the reign of Ramses II, 19th dynasty, 13th century BC, the name of Libu, or the Libyans, first appears. The garments of the Libu chiefs were garments which were decorated similarly to those of the Tamahu, whose name appears as early as the 6th dynasty, several centuries earlier. Tamahu, as I have stated before, occupies the oasis adjacent to Nubia in Sudan and presumably Karga in the western desert in southern Egypt. At Es-Subah in Nubia, an inscription tells of the Tamahu, who in the 5th year of Merneptah, 19th dynasty, led a raid against Egypt under the Tamahu Maraye, son of Ded, along with other Libyans called Kehek and the peoples of the sea. It was the Libu who, as a branch of the Tamahu, launched invasions against the Egyptian dynasty of Merneptah. They did so in alliance with the descendants of the non-African sea peoples who were of Euro-Asian origin. These Euro-Asians are also represented in Egyptian iconography of the Westerners. The name of one king of the Libu of that time was Meshkin. It is, according to Bates, the same as the much later name of the Numidian king called Misogenes by the Romans, a son of a ruler named Massinissa of the 3rd century BC, and in Berber, according to him, would mean son of heaven. The existence of kings among the Numidians and Morai is first directly attested to at the end of the 5th century before Christ, about the same time Herodotus wrote of the Libyans. By the end of the 3rd century BC, the kingdoms of the Masalesai, who are one of the Libyans mentioned by Herodotus, and Masalai, had emerged from among the Mori in the western part of North Africa. Some of the names of the rulers of the Moors, as named by Procopius and others, seem to reflect their ethnic affinity with the so-called Hamitic stock of Ethiopia and Sudan, especially modern Cushitic speakers. Gaia, Bagoda, Asilis, Baga are reminiscent of the present names for rulers, chiefs, and princes, not only among modern Tuareg or Berbers, but Nilotic and Cushitic tribes of East Africa. Gaia was probably Kaya among Berbers and Cushites, and the same QE means ruler in Meroe, Nubia. Arcalis or Agalid is Aguilid or Okel of the Berbers and Kel of the East African area. Bagoda is prince or religious head, as is Bukharis of ancient Nubia and the modern Cushites, a legendary Hausa king and god of the Nilo-Saharan Teta. In the 4th century AD, the Mari Bowers or Bavares are mentioned along with the Kinke Gentiani or Mauri Gensani and Frexis as breaking into the Moroccan area of ancient Numidia. The Bavares or Bar-Eres are also called Bavares of the Kabyle. It was one of the Kabyle chieftains, Gildo, whose name is the Berber title Galid or Aguilid, whom Claudian complained about when he spoke of all the hideous Ethiopian hybrids being conceived with the Roman women. Gildo belonged to a family of rebellious rulers of the Kabylian Bavares, who were Mori Bavares of other texts. He had a brother named Masezel, which is Amazegzel, the modern Berber or Tuareg tribal name. In the east were other descendants of the Libau. Herodotus describes a Libyan contingent in the Persian army 480 BC using wooden spears. After the death of Xerxes, the Persian king of the 5th century BC, Enheru, chief of the Adormachidae, in alliance this time with the Greeks, led a revolt against the Achaemenids of Persia, who were in control of Egypt. The Libyan Adormachidae had a nymph named Amphithemis as their ancestress, as did the Psylli and Machiles, according to the ancient writer Agrostis. That name may be connected with that of the Akkadian water goddess Tiamat. In the 1st century BC, Diodorus Siculus stated that in northern Tunisia, a lieutenant of a Greek tyrant from Syracuse called Agathocles overcame a people in the 4th century BC whose skin color was, quote, like that of Ethiopians. In the time of this invasion, Libyans called Massiles were in control of the Tunisian area. These indigenous Libyan tribesmen were later called Afri or Afur, Afaracani or Frexis by the Romans and Moors or Morisoi. The writings of Pliny, Josephus, Cleodemus, and later Arab traditions all say that they both came across Africa with Hercules and by way of the Red Sea or Berber region now called Abyssinia and Eritrea, and imply that they were associated with the incense trading peoples on both sides of the Red Sea. Perhaps the name of the present-day Afar in Djibouti and Ethiopia is connected. Certain Tuareg tribes, especially in Niger, still call their ancestors Argulan. Although Carthage, which was in the area of Tunis, was a Phoenician colony, most Libyans, like the Afar, composed the Carthaginian army. Native Carthaginians formed a very small portion of the troops. The Egyptian portrayal of Carthaginian soldiers leave no question as to the Ethiopian-like appearance of the Libyans or North Africans of that area and era. Sometimes Greek and Gallic mercenaries were used as well. The Afaracani, in particular, had learned new military techniques, serving as heavy infantry in the Punic army, and the best light infantry troops were javelin throwers recruited from the Numidians and Morai, who were the inhabitants of northern Algeria and what is now called Morocco. They adopted municipal institutions of Carthage, but frequently revolted against Carthaginian rule. This had happened once after the Carthaginians abandoned a large force of Libyans in Sicily a few centuries before Christ. Before the rise of the Carthaginian statesman Hanno in the 3rd century BC, Carthage, as the Phoenician colony, had been paying tribute to the surrounding Libyans. After this period, during the time of Hamilcar Barca and his son Hannibal, who incidentally in ancient texts was called Hannibal the Aphor, Carthage was holding sway over the area. Numidians and other Libyans went with the Afar, or Afro warriors led by Hannibal, across the Alps to subjugate the Romans, who were becoming a formidable and unbearable presence in Africa. Several centuries later, after the 6th century AD, descendants of these tribes under the name of Beni Ifrin or Ephuras, Mazigzel, Luata, Gadula, and Katama or Emakatan swept into Europe in the name of Muhammad. The present-day names of the dark-colored Tuareg tribes of Ephorus or Kel Farouan around Gat in Libya and Asben in Niger and elsewhere are the same as those of the peoples called Beni Ifrin in Algeria by the Arabs, and are the Ephoreses or Frexes of Pliny, a Pharaoh of Tunisia, and the Pharousai of the Atlas in Morocco, of the ancient Greeks and Romans. The Beni Ifrin mentioned in Arab writings were found in the area of Tlemcen, near Oran in northwest Algeria, quite close to Morocco, and in the Garian in western Libya. Representations of chariots from Hogar to southern Oran, through southern Morocco and the western High Atlas may be associated with them. The Ephoreses, or Frexes, in the Tunisian area in Pliny's time are the reason why the name Africa originally denoted the Tunisian area. Historians know that one of the earliest mentions of the camel in North Africa first appears in association with a Berber people called Zenata, who were comprised of the Ephors and other tribes. The Zenata also early occupied the Cyrene area of the country now called Libya during the Roman era. The word Afra and Afur came to be used for a time for black Africans according to Rogers. Mori Mezikes are mentioned as a small nation of Ethiopians in the area of Tripoli and Tunis in the 4th century AD. In the 4th and 5th centuries, the Mazikes, who were called a fierce Libyan people and who had ravaged the oasis next to Egypt and the Fezzan area, Libya, were said by Evagrius to be in allegiance with the Blemmyes of Nubia. The word Blemmyes comes from Belmit, the Coptic word for the Beja or Bedouin tribes of the Nubian desert. The Mazikes were the people called Lavathes by Procopius and Corippus by the 6th century. They are said to have among them the pitiless pillaging Astacures or Astraches, who were mentioned earlier as being inhabitants of both Ethiopia and Libya. It is possible that the Astora and Mazikes were the same as the people called Blemmyes in Ethiopia, whose rulers were called Ilyam Meshi. In any case, it is known that the Luata tribes are in part the ancestors of the modern Tuareg. The people of the Astores or Astriques are known under similar names today. From their name probably comes the modern name of the Tuareg, who are also called Tura or Tarjai, depending on the region. Some suppose, however, that the name Tuareg is the same as the Arab word meaning tribe. The Tuareg are a confederation of Berber tribes whose men wear veils and turbans. They are camel owners now dwelling in the Saharan and Sahel areas. The description of the Astores as fierce and much feared pillagers is one that was quite appropriate for the Tuareg to the beginning of this century. Their nobles are still called Emoshag or Amazigan. In fact, Emoshag is a generic term for Berber nobles. Tamashek, the language of the Tuareg, means belonging to the Mashek or Mazikes. In their least modified form, they are dark brown in color, tall and lanky, with elongated limbs, long faces and narrow noses, and an extreme long-headedness, which one noted historian felt was due to having migrated from their Hamitic homeland in East Africa. The Tuareg women marry at will, speak in council, serve as heads of encampments, hold property, govern the home. The children take on the name and rank of their mothers. Tuareg women, rather than men, teach their children to write. They are found in areas extending from Mauritania through Mali and Algeria to Chad and Libya. The Tuareg have many customs and features in common with the Beja Kushites, which may speak for a common region of origination. The Fulani as Gaitules. Probably the best living example in North Africa of those originally nomadic peoples called Libyans are the modern-day red or pastoral Fulani, as opposed to the settled Fulani, especially belonging to the area of Niger and Mali. Though they themselves are probably descendants of only one of the waves of Libyans from the east, they represent the black Berber or Hamitic prototype which has existed in the Sahara for at least 5,000 years. At Yabarin, the rock art shows cattle transporting the armature of huts, which is a practice maintained by the Fulani, and the headgear, clothing, and most typical physical characteristics of the human figures of the pastoral period are said to resemble the present-day Fulani. They have, except for their language, many habits of dress and accoutrements in common with Somali and Rendili, and at times a strong familial resemblance to Cushitic peoples in general. These nomads are one of the few tribes whose attire still resembles the long garments worn by the Libyans on ancient Egyptian tomb paintings after the New Empire. On these garments are the same designs that appear on C group pottery and in Libyan tattoos. They also wear the same hats and peculiar Libyan side lock and other coiffures shown in representations of ancient Libyans. They still practice the burning of the temples of infants, which Herodotus mentions as being common to all Libyans. They often have a hairstyle in which they leave their hair long in the back like the ancient Libyans called mashlice. Their women wear their hair in a crest like the Cushitic speakers and the other Berbers of the southern Sahara, which was said to be typical of Libyan women. This form of hairdress is shown often in ancient rock art now in the Sahara. It was apparently a very ancient practice and of totemic or religious significance. It is found among dark-skinned Yemeni women as well. The pastoral Fulani are the only people in West Africa who milk their cattle, and though they have recently been touched by modernization, rarely did they raise cattle for food. The ancient Libyans did not eat the cow, considering them sacred. Like many traditional Cushitic and Nilo-Saharan peoples, they tend to know each of the members of their herds by name and treat them with great affection and respect. The Fulanis of Takrur were called Beni Warith or Waritan of the Beni Godala or Jadala in the Annales Regnum Mauritaniae, Annals of the Mauritanian Kings, and the writing of El-Bakri. They were said to have once lived in the Mauritanian Adrar. Godala is the Arab pronunciation of the earlier Gaituli of the Roman historians. The Gaitules were the most populous of the Libyan tribes of Strabo's time, 1st century AD. Josephus around the same period claimed that they were the same as the Eviloi of Kush or the peoples of ancient Avalis, the Zila of present-day Somalia, which might explain why the Fulani today resemble so much the people of that region. The Gadala were considered one of the major Berber tribes by Arab writers and the brethren of the Nbaya and Sahanya or Berbers of the Maghrib. Furthermore, when the Fulani were first encountered by European colonists, they spoke more than one language. One of these is connected to other West African languages. The other one, however, was considered different enough for the explorers to speculate that it was more related to dialects outside of Africa. If the Fulani, as suggested by El-Bakri and the Mauritanian annals were Godala, then it is most likely their ancestors are the same as those of the Cushitic speakers who now inhabit the Horn of Africa, and that are also the same as the lightly built Libyan Gaetules who lived further north during the Roman era and took part in the founding of Numidia. C groups as ancestors of the Eastern Libyans. There is a strong resemblance, according to a number of scholars, between the ancient prehistoric culture of the southern Sahara and those of the ancient pastoral cultures in Nubia, especially represented by the C group population. One specialist in African archaeology, David Phillipson, has relatively recently stated that the affinities of C group pottery strongly suggest a Saharan origin. However, Gabriel Camps before this had shown that ancient Saharan industries possessed close affinity with the Neolithic industries of the Nilotic area. The rock art of the Tassili region of Algeria and also in Enedi of Chad and the Tibesti region, a pastoral period between the 4th and 3rd millenniums BC, depicted cattle with horns deformed and with curious pendants typical of those of the Nubian, especially C group area and further east. Fine sculptured cattle and other anthropomorphic cult figures appear at the sites as they do east of the Nile. The men are often represented, according to Camps, as men resembling the Fulani, slim with dark complexions and small pointed beards, rather like those portrayed in rock arts of the Arabian desert spoken of by Anati. Ancient stone tumulus graves in the western part of the southern Sahara are reminiscent of those built by C group. The territory of the Tamahu, or Temahu, has been suggested to have corresponded to the general area of the C group populations who occupied the Libyan desert of Sudan and parts of Nubia. Both A. Arkell and Bates have come to conclude that the C group Nubians represented a Libyan people. A. Arkell and Bates also felt the people of this culture, C group, were the Libyans whom the Egyptians called Temahu, who are mentioned as early as a 6th dynasty inscription in a land to the south of Egypt. C group pottery has been found in the Gilf Kebir in Libya and the Wadi Hawar to the west of Nubia in the Libyan desert. C group people were also affiliated with the kingdom of Kerma in Nubia. The C group material affords several representations of the human figure. Some are wearing crossbands, which were so frequent in Egyptian portrayals of the Libyans. Bates also found correlations between the designs on C group pottery and ancient Libyan tattoo marks, both of which he illustrates in his book, The Eastern Libyans. He also notes that one of the female figures represented on the pottery was a woman wearing a kirtle, like the Libyan women are shown wearing in the ancient Egyptian portrayals. In addition, the fact that there was a cow cultus in the C group complex, which was paralleled by the Libyans, the similarities in material culture, and the fact that the C group cemeteries were in a distinct geographically connected with the Egyptian oasis are factors which he finds to be evidence of the Libyan connection of these remains. C group populations skeletally, according to Bates, bore an indubitable resemblance to those of ancient Egypt, but became increasingly mixed with other African populations. The potter of the later Meroitic period retained resemblances with that of the C group. Other modern specialists have come to associate the spread of C group with the early radiation of Nilo-Saharan speaking peoples. The huts of Nilo-Saharan speaking tribes living in modern Ethiopia resemble those pictured on a Meroitic vase at Karanog. The Nilotic peoples create small cattle cult figurines and deform the horns of their cattle, as do the Cushites. It is likely that the Nilo-Saharans, like the Teda and Zeghawa groups and Maasai, who physically have been described as half-Hamites, and whose pastoral culture shows many resemblances to modern-day Cushitic or ancient troglodytes of the Red Sea nations, emerged from a confluence of distinguishable African physical types in the Nubian area, and moved at different times westward and then south and eastward, carrying religious and ontological notions, customs, and varying degrees of technology of the Kermer and Meroitic kingdoms with them. Archaeological evidence for the Nubian affiliation of the Berbers. Just as other nomadic peoples like Nilo-Saharans anciently and more recently the Fulani have extended themselves across the Sudan from Senegal to East Africa, it seems ancient Nubian nomads originating east of the Nile ancestral to modern Beja and Afar had from an early period spread themselves over the North African area between the Atlantic and Red Sea, retaining their names. To them may have been due the horse chariot, and later the camel and veil in North Africa. As Oric Bates, writer of the Eastern Libyans, pointed out, the stone tumulus graves of Nubia, typical of C group and Pangrave culture, closely resemble the type found in the Western Sahara called by the Tuareg Regem or Argem. The tombs, regularly measuring 8 to 10 meters in diameter, contain burials in which the bodies are found in a contracted position. Offering niches were outside the superstructure of the tombs in both the Nubian and Saharan tombs. Henry Loti had noted that these graves found in the location of Ayer, Ain Sephra, Arenis, Cyrenaica in the Adar and Aforis, and in the Asgar Tassili in Algeria recall the present-day geographical situation of the Tuareg. These tombs are considered rather late in date, later than the pastoralist phase mentioned previously in date, but pre-Islamic. These tombs were also studied by Camps and described by him as being made of stones of diverse dimensions, circumscribed at the base by a range of larger stones fixed in the earth. They are the most frequent of burial monuments in North Africa, extending from above the Atlas throughout the Sahara to the Niger and from the Nile to the Canary Isles. They appear in Rio de Oro, Fezzan, Cyrenaica, and Abyssinia. He calls them a type as ancient as the Memphite period in Egypt. The body was found normally in the customary retracted position. Camps said this type of tomb with niches or chapels were built by the Equidian or chariot-using Berbers, whom he describes as warriors armed with javelin and armed dagger, plumed with ostrich feather, and at times associated with crescent-shaped monuments. In fact, such men appearing in the rock drawings near the tombs wearing single feather and tunics are curiously reminiscent of the Cushitic-speaking Beja and Danakil, Afar, who wear a single black feather in their hair and arm daggers or wrist knives. An early French mission to the Central Sahara found ancient pottery there formed on a basket-work matrix, which showed close similarity to pottery made on baskets in use among the Somali and Danakil, rather than on baskets now used in the Sahara. Iconographic and epigraphic evidence also suggest some connections of Saharans with pre-Christian Nubia. Ancient inscriptions in the Tuareg writing on rock paintings are found in association with depictions of camels, which are commonly used now by both the Tuareg and Teda, and anciently with representations of what Camps calls the evolved Libyan warriors, who are depicted through a bitriangular schematicism. The figures are sometimes associated with horses and other triangle configurations. The triangle is representative of the horn. The horn in Saharan parlance, and probably in early Erythrean or Afro-Asiatic culture in general, is associated symbolically with and signifies the hearth or fire altar. The Tuareg saddle pommel, composed of 3 conical figurines, resembles triple-pronged altars on Nubian pottery. At Naga'a, the deities hold weapons with cruciform handles exactly like the Tuareg saddle pommel. The trident is a symbol for the god of water, and for the Kanuri it signified the hearth. In the Tassili at Owen Melon, in the Sahara, there are 3 figures with 2 triangles comprising their chest and there are faces with long pointed ears, resembling certain mouthless faces with long ears, on Karanog pottery in Nubia. At Owan Bender, a hut made of triangles is associated with a camel. Certain of the Adubini tombs of the desert show horned or antennaed tombs reminiscent of these same mouthless faces. The designs on Nubian pottery at Karanog circa the 4th 3rd century AD and elsewhere consist of triangles and horned altars at the trident. Rock drawings of horned altars appear in Nubia, at Tafta, or on pottery. Sometimes they are decorated altars with a pedestal and horns on X group pottery. Those that appeared in southern Egypt, the horned altars, are ascribed to the Blemyes by Hans Winkler. These altars were considered to be connected with the table of the sun of the Macrobian Ethiopians, mentioned by Homer, 8th century BC, and Herodotus, who had their houses underground like the later Ethiopian troglodytes called Megabari, mentioned by Strabo, Diodorus, and others several centuries later, who were most likely the same people. Beja ethnicity and origins. As mentioned previously, the group of people called Astores or Astriques, who were said to be native to both Ethiopia and Libya, may be the forebearers of those first to be called Tuareg and Tura and Durku in Africa. It is most likely that the migration that brought the camel and veil came into North Africa from the area east of the Nile long after the introduction of the horse. J. A. Rogers said that the Berbers claimed descent from the tribes who were called the Matsoi in Nubia. This correlates well with the statement made by Ibn Khaldun of the origination of the Tuareg of the Maghreb or veiled Berbers in the Rif area of Abyssinia. Even in the rather famous Sudanese work, Infaq al-Masuri, Muhammad Bello claimed that the Tuareg or Beriberi are the remnant of the Berbers who lived between Zinj and Habash, which was the Afar area. There is a considerable mass of historical evidence to suggest that the Tuareg were in part a westward extension of the Ethiopian troglodytes known in more remote times as Blemyes, Beja, and Majayu, or Madid and Afar, and that they were the people who brought a type of tomb common to both Abyssinia and the Nile to the Sahara. Certain archaeologists have identified the Majayu and the Blemyes with the cultural complex called Pangrave in Nubia, which showed close affinities to the C group complex. The Majayu, or Madid in late text, people who occupied Nubia and the desert mainly east of the Nile, were the soldier caste or policemen used by the ancient Egyptians. They are considered ancestral to the ancient Blemyes or modern Beja, who are Cushitic-speaking nomadic pastoralists who lived in skin tents. They were matrilineal, had camels, and innumerable cattle and sheep. The word Beja is the same as Bediyat or Badawi, from which comes the word Bedouin. It was a name of the tribes of the eastern desert of Sudan in the time of the Arab writers especially. Modern Beja, Afar, and other Cushites occupy the same areas near the Red Sea as the peoples anciently called Troglodytes. They were a people mentioned by Agatharcides, Diodorus, and Strabo. The country of the Beja was called, according to Saidi, Southern Egyptian Arab lexicon, mentioned by Quatremere in the second volume of his Memoirs sur l'Egypte Taourek. This was most probably the area of Tuareg, mentioned in the time of Amenophis as a region which had been invaded by an Egyptian army. And the countries of the Troglodytes were the same as those called Berber by the Romans. These were people whom, according to Agatharcides and others, called their mothers sheep and their fathers rams. They were circumcised and drank milk mixed with blood. They buried their dead under erected mounds of stones capped with the horns of their cattle. At funerals, laughing took place. They often made their homes among rocks and ravines or grottos, as do some of the present-day Afar tribes. It has been surmised that their name came to be a punning homophone for a cave dweller or one who dwells underground or in grottos. Troglodytes occupied the coastal regions along both sides of the Red Sea, and their country was the land of Punt, now identified as the modern-day Mercer Gawasis, a port town in the Horn of Africa. There was another Punt called Opone further south around the time of the Christian era, and Mogadishu was said to have been called the Pearl of the land of Punt. According to Strabo, a major group of troglodytes lived on the African side of the Red Sea, for troglodytes inhabited both sides, were called Irembi. There were, however, several troglodyte or Beja peoples, the most important being called Megabarai and Bolgoi, or Irembi, among whom were a people called Belmint or Blemese, who were perhaps the same as the Bolgoi. The ancient troglodyte practices recall those of the present-day Kushites and Nilo-Saharan speakers especially, and to a certain extent the Libyans, as the ancient Libyans who were said to have dwelled in caverns and man-made grottos. Modern-day Kushites and Nilo-Saharan speakers like the Nandi, Masai, Karamanjong, Arakwa, Bari of southern Sudan drink milk mixed with blood. Bongo, Moro and Zandi erect mounds of stones, and Nandi laugh at their funerals. Often these people place cattle horns on the tombs, as do some of the Kushites. Most of the speakers of the Eastern Sudanic branch of the Nilo-Saharan speakers, the Noba, the Tama, and Daju, and Nilotic Masai Samburu, Shilluk peoples, have traditions of dispersal from the Nile Valley in or near Nubia. It is interesting that when the Ike, who now inhabit Uganda, were first written about by Colin Turnbull, linguists could only find a relationship of their dialect to the Middle Kingdom Egyptian dialect. A. Arkell mentions also colonies of potters who speak a Nilo-Saharan dialect and are called Tama, living in the north of Sudan, traditionally said to be from Bur Natrun, a place which is now desert. The designs on their pottery imitate those of C group pottery. As stated before, the huts of Nilo-Saharan speakers in Ethiopia have been noted to bear resemblance to those on a meriatic vase. Among the remaining grotto dwellers further west are the Nilo-Saharan Tibu Tata. Pliny, Strabo, and others refer to troglodytes of Tassili in Algeria and in the Anti-Atlas range in Morocco. The Farusai, for us, are the Libyans whom Strabo says lived in caves or grottos and were in this region. They are mentioned in the south of Morocco by Sallust. End of the African Heritage and Ethno-history of the Moors, Part 2 by Dana Reynolds. Please support this channel by clicking on the links below.